Hi, my name is Amit Chaudhuri, and I'm at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I'm with my friend, the poet and critic Charles Bernstein, uh, who, in his generosity, has lent me his time. He's going to share his thoughts with us, and he's also lent me his phone to do this. To do what I'm thinking of calling interviews on site. The idea of it came when Charles and I and my wife and some other friends did a tour of this museum in early 2019, and Charles was just speaking to me as we were walking, and you know he was kind of deconstructing the museum in a sense, and that word takes on a kind of new meaning when we're talking about something quite solid and at the same time full of symbolic and cultural capital, things that can't be seen. Um, so you know, I, I, I've, I've wanted to have this chat again, not replicate the original chat, but have the opportunity to kind of go through that journey again, and then present it and let the world kind of eavesdrop on Charles. So this is what this whole kind of on-site interview is about.
Now, just for a second, to indulge me in my we just take a shot of you from so we see that you're actually here. That it isn't a voice.
Person,
it
yes.
isn't a voiceover.
Yeah.
So I thought we would just start with the first thing that I'm seeing.
Charles,
You know,
yeah,
I should say we're on 53rd Street and 5th Avenue. So I grew up about 1 mile from here. So this is exists very much in my throughout my life. All my life, not very far from here. And so the first thing I want to show is just this is new. It's just a signage, but it is the Museum of Modern Art. And what's striking about it is the excruciating banality and almost propagandistic aspect to it. This is a museum that's supposed to be reflecting on art, and yet it puts up this somewhat absurd change is modern, as if somehow there wasn't change earlier. What would change possibly mean? Now, what they're saying is they're adding new things to the collection. People have criticized their collection for being too Eurocentric and too white, and their way of responding to that is to say change is modern. Well, they never thought of that before, and in fact, they say that nothing is permanent, but the whole concept of the Museum of Art was to create a permanent canon of European and American abstraction and modernism that was meant to be permanent. And it brings to mind the wonderful Gertrude Stein quote about this museum: you can be modern or you can be a museum, but you can't be both. Now,
Excellent.
that's from 100 years ago that Stein said that. But let us walk along and just
Can I just ask you something?
Yes, ask me something. Okay.
So, Charles, you just talked about the fact that the Museum of Modern Art, initially sort of was a way of putting together collections of American and European modern art, right?
Right.
And
more European to some degree
More
initially,
European, yeah.
but to establish
Yeah.
a canon of modern art and the significance universally as commodity value of the art. Now, of course, I have to say when I'm saying any of this about the Museum of Modern Art and the original collection by William Barr, that's my favorite artwork, and it's the work that I'm most influenced by. I love this work, and in nothing that I'm saying there's anything negative about any of the artists who are my favorites, but it has to do with the way in which it's framed.
But the ease with which a museum like this claims European art.
Yes.
On one level, of course, the ease, if it's kind of exhibited by an artist in their relationship to history, so they're claiming various traditions with
Yeah.
ease. But in an institution like this, when something like European art is claimed with such ease, without any kind of explanation, where do you think that comes from?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's claimed with ease. I think because it's American, and when it was founded, I think it was trying to establish a kind of an American presence, and also America's ability to discern what was great and permanent aesthetically.
In France as well.
In Europe, as well as to bring in American, the best of American art, from their point of view, the best, fitting into those criteria. And I think that was a difficult struggle, and I think it was actually radical initially. And of course, when they first showed the art that they were showing, it was still somewhat scandalous. It wasn't acceptable as art. There was a kind of a resistance to radical modernism, and they put it forward, and they were in a much more modest building, and that was a great thing. And some of the claims don't sit well for me now philosophically, but they were also part of, putting forward a kind of universalism of this art that they're talking about. And at the same time, we're, we're a century after the establishment of the great modernist canon that the museum did so much to do. So you can rethink what that is and how it exists within the world as we know more about the world and we know more about that history. And they do that here, but they do it in a way that is not integrative, but rather sectional, so that they will add stuff that's very progressive and terrific and multicultural and global, but in separate shows and separate little, not little necessarily, but often niche or boutique spots. But the central conception of what abstraction is, what modernism is left, unchanged, inviolable, and permanent.
And that central conception, however, doesn't put American artists and European artists necessarily in separate sections.
No, that's true.
They flow into each other.
That's right. So that's an interesting part of
what I meant
the
about
radical
the ease.
claim,
Yes.
that it wants to bring the American art, which wouldn't necessarily have been as fully recognized within this, European
Because
context.
Tagore's and Stella Cramridge tried to do something similar in Calcutta in 1922, when Tagore invited Bauhaus artists and their art and juxtaposed their paintings with Bengali artists.
Right. Well, I mean, of course, that's a fantastic thing, and very the opposite of. It's not the. I think you said it better than I could, because you're more. I'm immersed in this history. I'm struggling to pull myself out of it. You're seeing it already from a different place, but I would say that idea of putting Bengali artists next to Bauhaus artists, which is what I'm advocating, and many other people, Thomas McEvely, most significantly in an earlier show in his critiques, would not be viewed in the same way, and would not be something that would be done within the U.S. context, because the U.S. is not viewed as the same as Southeast Asia or Bengal.
Sure.
But you're making that point. If you're doing, and I would say that is what's great about the art. You see, I think the artists are exactly moving in that direction 100 years ago or 120 years ago.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
There's a kind of synergy and even miscegenation. But it's difficult for the museum to fully recognize that miscegenation without seeming to compromise the permanence, the canonical quality, and really is aesthetic suprematism of the work that's put forward, rather than seeing that actually it makes the work of radical modernism and post-war European and North American art even more powerful if you put it into that
Absolutely.
context. Even more powerful and
Absolutely.
resonant.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to talk about, but let's look over here, just flash on this ceiling.
Yeah.
This is the main entrance lobby. There's no airport in the world that would be any worse than this
Absolutely.
entrance.
I completely agree.
And why, if it's the Museum of Modern Art, if it's proposing that it has the most radical, rich, powerful rethinking of design, why is the whole lobby that you come in based on, the worst level of airport? It's not even a hotel. of airport design. And you go to this section
It's
too.
better than
This is
JFK
just
though. I mean, I think it's called.
well, there are sections of Newark Airport which aren't as nice as this. That is true. It aspires to be a kind of nice airport lounge. I mean, it boggles my mind and they spent millions of dollars on this, and millions of dollars on this. And by the way, right next door to us, in order to do their expansion of this museum, they tore down a beautiful small building, which was the Folk Art Museum. And the Folk Art Museum now has moved to Lincoln Center, and it's still in a great spot. But they tore down the Folk Art Museum to make this shrine, this palace, this cathedral of. And the problem with shrines, palaces, and cathedrals is there are saints, and there's blasphemy. And so I suppose I'm a blasphemer in terms of this idea of tearing down this smaller building. They could have left it there, but their conception is to have this kind of big corporate space. And now they're not
corporate and airport-like space.
Right, airport-like space as what brings it in, and also to actually destroy American Folk Art Museum, which is exactly what they should be. It's exactly what they missed on the first go-round. I'm not saying the curators here are not aware of the significance of folk art and primitive art, but they don't integrate it into the collection in the way that you're speaking of with Tagore, but also symbolically to tear down the Folk Art Museum, to build this cathedral of the modern, and then to have this. Nothing is permanent, to change your scene. Artists change how we see the world and how we feel. I mean, it's so excruciatingly banal. Let's go over to this Tony Smith.
Yeah. But people love that kind of banality, don't they?
Yes, well, people love that kind of banality, but wasn't the whole point of the Museum of Modern Art to challenge that banality?
Right.
So are they for it or are they against it? That's what I would say. You're absolutely right.
Careful about
Go
what
to
I say.
Disneyland.
When I said people, I have to be careful.
People like airports, I mean, it's not...
airports are the new cathedrals, and so they had that in mind when they rebuilt this.
I think you're completely right. What's wrong with my view is that it doesn't take into account that they're catering to what people like. And my point about the museum is that it stands for doing something different, but really it makes too many concessions to that and doesn't recognize something else related to what we just spoke about, but which I call the bad objects of modernism and abstraction. So if you're going to reify a certain kind of abstraction, I don't really believe that you can speak of abstraction as distinct from figuration, because I think that they're completely merged and it's a kind of a phony dualism. But let's say you have a conception, and this beautiful Tony Smith painting is an example. Now,
tell us a bit about Tony Smith, because not everybody in India or other parts of the world...
Well, he's not so well known here in a sense, but he's an abstract, post-abstract expressionist, a painter who also did architecture, and he did this almost kind of minimal work. It's quite beautiful, and you won't see in the video the beauty of the color and the richness of it. However, what I find fascinating is that it's almost exactly like the black cube is very much like the chair that's in front, the black cube here. The rim around the side is like the line that's on the floor, and the large spaces of the floor are kind of like the large spaces of the painting. So you wonder, is this like just an extension of the painting, the design, and is the zip line there? Is that an extension of the line there? But there's no irony or sense of humor about how the bad objects of modernism, that is to say, quotidian airport design and abstraction in...
Are those modernism, postmodernism? What
no, this
those
is
bad objects? I'm talking about
no,
airport stuff.
Bad objects would be the way in which the reified high art of the modernist period, or in this case the post-war period, reflect things that go on within popular culture, which are equally abstract, equally disfiguring, but which aren't accorded the status of art. But they can't be completely excluded from art. And then on the other hand, the exclusion of not only things outside of the European and North American canon, such as folk art, as we mentioned, or art from the rest of the world, but also textile design, fabrics, and so on, which they systematically wish to keep as something separate than the artwork, which is an untenable argument. You can't separate industrial design, textile design, entirely from the visual art work, just because somebody puts it on a canvas. And then once you get into that, you get into a history of hundreds of years of pattern making on textiles, on pottery, on building facades. And to say, well, that's not art because it's not designated as art, you should say the opposite, that the radicalness of the most radical modernists was to break art from that conception of the canvas, as the Russian futurists or Duchamp made insistent. It doesn't make it art, actually. Those artists were trying to move art away from that museum conception of art. And that's what this museum both represents, but also is in a kind of repression.
So you're saying they're missing something by not kind of seeing this kind of weird juxtaposition between this kind of furniture and floor.
Yes. Well,
it's completely accidental.
It is accidental, but it's pervasive at the same time.
And
because just look here.
While on the other hand, I mean, these modernist artists had this great understanding in India too, of like filmmakers like Manikal, but Tagore, various others, of abstraction of Indian design. And how that could be brought into everyday life, both through what people were doing,
goes both ways,
and wearing, but also, and here I'm thinking about a designer called Riten Mozumdar, but also what filmmakers were doing and artists were doing.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's certain. There are reasons for categories and genres, and Tony Smith is doing something very, very interesting. But it also mirrors something which is seemingly outside, and what perhaps is radical about it here is the fact that it mirrors the space it's in a way that isn't completely acknowledged. Look over there, over the top of the stairway. You see, there's another, like 16 shades of gray.
Yeah.
Not unlike
So you're saying that they're doing nothing with it. What you're saying is that it's completely
they're saying
inadvertent.
that's just the design, and then
And
this is the great art.
This is art.
And what's the argument for that?
Yeah. Okay.
So perhaps we should go upstairs.
Go up, yeah.
So I would say turn this off. This is classic.
Hey, Charles, we are on our way to the collections, the kind of mainstay of this.
And up escalators. Very involved with traffic flow here at the museum. Oh, don't trip as we go up and ascend.
Don't worry, I'm not getting you.
We're going to see such splendid art. I have to put my sunglasses on.
Absolutely.
Because
you'll be dazzled, right?
It's so overwhelming.
Yeah. It's dazzling.
It's so dazzling that I feel the sunglasses help a little bit.
Yeah. I agree. I wish I had mine.
So I don't get overwhelmed. Whoa. Now here's another one of my set pieces. This is as good as any installation art. Look at the fantastic patterns of the white and black lines, which actually, by the way, very similar to my sport jacket. Echo my sport jacket. And then the black piece there. Also the informal use of the knapsack,
Yes.
just to the side, a somewhat powerful, almost like
What is that?
modernist. Well, it's a sculpture that indicates the kind of it's a sculpture that's taken out of everyday life,
Right.
and that but shows still the power of the industrial, but out of service.
They're actually protecting it,
Yeah,
unlike the
well,
other
yeah.
sculptures.
So you can, and then this fantastic trap.
Yes.
Is also very evocative. So also it's very much of a 3D
But it has no.
piece.
It has no
wires, circuits.
Yeah.
That's really the centerpiece is this
The best thing is
three-pronged.
there is no artist connected to it. It's
Well,
an
I don't-
anonymous piece of work.
No,
It's self-generating.
This has been done by Bruno Kubulakuk. He's a German artist where it was working in the
really?
mid-1970s.
Oh.
Very powerful.
And this is part of it.
Well, it's yes. Stop. Do not enter.
Okay.
It's very, very good. Also, you can see the Schindler. Because it's also, by the way, it's a Holocaust reference, Schindler's List. Because then it brings to mind the sort of
that's it.
darker.
That's it.
Schindler's List. That's a great movie by Steven Spielberg.
Is that right?
Yes, Schindler, which is about the Holocaust. Yeah.
Yes.
Schindler protected, saved a number of Jews.
It's a black and white film, right?
No, I think it's in color. Schindler's List.
Yeah.
I don't know how we're supposed to go up except to take the.
We have
Actually,
to,
there's elevators in the back, which we can go to. You know, a part of what interests me in this sardonic tour of the Museum of Modern Art with you is the nature of what interpretation is and what makes something art. And so, as what I was saying about the other part of this work, if you interpret something as art, this is your Chompian idea, but you put a frame around it and say this is art, that's part of the beauty of art, that it allows you to hear things both in a sublime and a debased way. So, I mean, this part, which is actually quite powerful, is a performance, and it brings to mind one of the most successful shows that they had here, Maria Abramovich, who in the main rotunda downstairs sat the whole time, for the whole time the show was open, and people sat in front of her, and also there were a number of pieces of hers that were created with human bodies. So even when you walk from one room to another, there were two semi or naked women who were standing, and you had to walk between them. And what's interesting about what they've done here, and they're not telling you that it's art by the artist that I mentioned in the previous segment, but this is also a very radical intervention.
what about the people
have-
climbing up the still escalator?
The people climbing up the still escalator are just the tourists. Can't you tell the difference? I mean, I'm shocked.
I find
a
it
person
more
as
and more difficult.
cultured as you. Artwork is just these workers, because it's fenced off. Do not enter, and it's a idea of creating performance art and installation within the museum.
Okay, excellent. So now we are about to step in to kind of the main shrine, main bit of the kind of cathedral, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you can see, people sort of walking towards what's happening. So I will let you speak as you did in 2019. Just give me a sense of these paintings and what they're doing.
I ain't no art historian, you know. I just come here since I'm a child. And, you know, I like.
Did you actually come here as
When
you were
a teenager.
teenager? Yeah.
Maybe not as a child. Maybe I first came here in.
When did your sense of resistance to what it was saying begin to kind of?
Well, not then. No, I was very much of
Obviously not then.
a.
When did it happen? do you
Yeah,
think?
I would
Is it
say
now?
probably I became, I'm in college, I became more aware of the limitations of the discourse around the visual arts and the issues that I'm just sort of joking about now.
So you actually love these artists and
I
paintings.
still do. None of the work makes me feel in any way less.
But what you are kind of skeptical about is what's happening when they become part of this language
Right.
that MoMA is sharing or putting out.
Right. Well, it's not just MoMA, but let's stay from this. Jackson Pollock, certainly. Jackson Pollock, one of my absolute favorite artists. And this is let's see here. Yeah, 43, She-Wolf. I mean, this is a wonderful piece to talk about because it relates to in college, thinking about Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock, we'll have them later in the collection. His work slightly after this.
Sorry?
His work slightly after this moves into what Michael Fried and other people, Clement Greenberg, would have referred to as pure abstraction, pure opticality, where you can't see any figuration.
Sure.
And this is what I began to object to in college, the work of those people. Well, I think they are two of the greatest critics, by the way. And everything I'm saying really, to me, just makes the painting even greater. But it's the way that it's institutionalized and framed and reified that, to me, undercuts the greatness of the art. It's not that I'm saying that the art is overvalued, but that the framing undervalues it. The very attempt to overvalue it actually limits what's even more, you could say, ontologically radical about it. And Pollock is a fantastic shapeshifter. So in these early works, he calls it She-Wolf. You actually, there's a figurative name. There's a figurative name, and you can see the figuration in this painting, and coming closer to surrealism and the biomorphic, and the fact that the images pop out and disappear is what's great. In the official Museum of Modern Art story, if we could call it that anyway, of some critics, they would say that the work becomes even greater when there's no metamorphosis between figure and abstraction, when you no longer have the popping of images in the painting, like of the She-Wolf here. So this early work is considered great, but not as great as Blue Poles and so on that you'd see later. And I think that that's a great misunderstanding on both sides, that these are, one is intrinsic in the other. The figuration pops out of abstraction and abstraction morphs into figuration. And in that sense, if that's your criteria, this painting is as great as Blue Poles. It's great to see it. It's the first thing you're seeing.
Yeah.
Now you were showing me some...
But you had a kind of sort of problem with this kind of carte blanche dating of the beginnings of abstraction.
Right. Well, that's the larger question would be, of course, this is where we're seeing this, even though the collection here, this is called graph abstraction. A word I've used too many times already in this conversation. So it shows you how influenced I am, and I have to push back. But Pollock is post-war, so really, yes, in the invention of abstraction, we'll see further as we move into the next room.
And of course, I mean, it's like the point you made downstairs. I mean, it's not making any use of these blank walls, which are only kind of things, and that schoolboys and you and I will notice repeatedly.
Right.
That is this abstraction as well. I mean,
Right, or
it's
the
a
floor.
schoolboy joke. But museums are resolutely against making kind of incorporating and
well,
preempting
in
those
a way,
jokes.
I like that kind of prank, and that's why I like Duchamp, for example, who certainly is not an original point. Duchamp is very much along those lines.
So you have to wonder how much they notice abstraction, the museums
it's what's
outside
framed,
of the
yeah.
frame.
Absolutely, and then there's the question of what the history of abstraction is, and
So tell me
not
something.
seeing it entirely within the context of a development of European art, which is a powerful argument for sure, away from three-dimensionality toward flatness. But with Pollock, as with many of the other so-called abstract or abstract expressionists, there's lots of different influences, and of course his work is really interested in optical illusion and the play of misseeing and misperceiving and re-seeing, which has a different kind of history. And also this work also has a closer connection, this one, to a so-called folk art or
Yes.
untaught art, and you see it now, and you see a Thornton Dial painting, a black, great black so-called folk art or unschooled artist. It's actually quite a lot like Thornton Dial, but you wouldn't normally see a Thornton Dial juxtaposed with Pollock, although nowadays you would, because many people, nothing I'm saying is original. Other people write about that and will say similar things.
A question, and also it's something I wanted to share with the video.
Yeah.
This is from the early 19th century. Painter called Budake is painting. The curators called it the cosmos. One might call it anything. But these are 3 panels. Aman Singh of Jodhpur has commissioned these paintings early 19th century. He's fallen under the spell of the Nath Yogis. They're doing some. It's if not the earliest expression of modern abstract art. This is kind of this attempt is
right, and it's very beautiful
else.
that you're bringing this up in respect to this painting, because this painting has a little bit of what the 3 panels have here, because out of cosmos, or perhaps emptiness, or nothingness, or blankness, emerges figuration. I mean, that's perhaps the Upanishadic story, very different than Genesis. And if you look at somebody like Pollock, it's kind of exhilarating to see him connecting to that, to that kind of way of looking at it, and therefore this blank space in the back, in the ground, is what these is what the figuration and even the chaotic figuration is coming out of. So you could also see this painting as a kind of cosmology or mythological, which both the title suggests a mythological.
When I look at this panel, I don't see it as a progression. I see it as 3 different takes. So yeah.
Whoa.
Each one has its own integrity. They're related to each other, but there are 3 different takes on this subject.
Now, having not seen them before the second, and seeing them small and seeing them in that order, I leapt to didactically. But I like this explanation better as multiple serial takes of something that you see as similar. But the fact that you see these 3 things as similar is a very powerful point, because one of them seems blank or abstract, depending on how you want to look at that term, but the other 2 have figures that are in the center of it. And the fact that you're saying that from your looking at it,
they each have equal weight,
but they're similar.
They're 3 moments.
Yeah, 3 moments. I mean,
not
that's
progression.
Right. And
not part of a progression.
So I want to learn from that and subscribe to that view of a multiple simultaneous rather than development. Even though I lapsed into a certain kind of idea of a sequence, but the simultaneity, the serial simultaneity in poetry, you have, invented really in the early part of the 20th century. Also, this idea of seriality rather than sequence. I attribute that especially to Charles Reznikoff and also George Oppen, where you have individual, discrete moments, particulars of poems that are put next to others without development, that are radically discrepant.
I feel the same about what's called narrative, and I feel the same about paragraphs. On one level, they are, they are placed in sequence. They have development. On the other hand, they are each fresh
could be
departures.
Used right. That's right. Fresh departures, and they can be permuted in different. They can be put into different kinds.
They could actually be put in different arrangements.
And so to go beyond that, but I think this is your point, but to extend what you said, I guess my point about the way art history trivializes and reifies in its worst instance, in its great instance it does the opposite. The artwork is not to allow for this conception of constant permutation and juxtaposition of difference by trying to create plots and narratives that can kind of hook people in, and then repeating it What you get when you go to a museum is you see these postcards of things that you recognize, like going to tourist attractions, UNESCO sites, but you don't see it anew. You see it within that context. Whereas if you see things as nothing is equal, of course, but if you see things as in specific instances and particulars that can be recombined and juxtaposed to allow for different and fresh ways of seeing them, you open up more to the possibility of what I think that modernist artists and poets were interested in 100 years ago.
Absolutely.
Or even 150 years ago. Or even 2,000 years ago. Not maybe 2,000, I got to think about that.
Well, no,
I
mean,
they
were thinking at that time about these things.
Well, it depends on where.
It
depends on where.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the other, big subject as to what is the relationship of decorative arts, art on clothing, art on pottery, art on everyday objects, is to this tradition of painting or sculpture. So there has been a tradition to exclude decorative things from this history, and it's really hard to see what the justification would be.
Or put religious iconography in the museum
That's right. Well, that would be another
the Oriental section,
Right,
or the Byzantine section, or whatever.
Well, and the history of this is dystopian, and I don't say that people now think
or to
that,
see
but
those
of
as
course,
sources for the
right.
modern.
I mean, certainly the Museum of Natural History would have had the indigenous, in other words, what we say Indian, indigenous, native people, were at the Museum of Natural History. Not in a modern art museum, but you look at those things and you say, wow, some of this stuff is
so this thing
it should be seen,
right?
And then there have been shows that have done that in various ways.
It's not time specific then, this word modern. So we think it is, but
maybe our view. I mean, modern has certainly something to do with.
It's a question of anomalousness, lateness, which occurs at different points of time in the last
right, in recognition.
Years.
So you could say, and again, following people like Thomas McEvely's critique of the primitivism show at this museum, which he felt trivialized the primitive art by putting it next to the Picassos and the great art and saying it was a source but not equal to it. You could say that the great art that we're looking at here opens us up to the world, that it is already making the point that we're discussing, the artists are, but that it's contained and reinscribed within a hierarchy and a commodity culture of the museum. Let me give you one radical example. We could I could actually talk as we walk along.
Yeah.
This museum had a show, not on this floor, of Sophie Tauber Arp. Sophie Tauber Arp, A-R-P. Wonderful. This is a nice, a better background as we talk. And her work was less known, certainly was involved with design, certainly progressing beyond the restrictions against the decorative arts, and allowing an equal space in the museum. But a number of her works were specifically copies of and modeled on the work of indigenous artists in probably New Mexico or the Southwest. So she took patterns and other things from this indigenous art, and she copied them. She put them in her paintings. Right. The museum, in its desire to be sensitive and progressive, didn't include any of this work. Because they said, well, this could be viewed as appropriation. She's appropriating. Well, I mean, why not say, first of all, if you like it or not, that's what she did. So actually to cut out that history is to just reinscribe. It's worse than that's worse than the worst possible case you could make on the appropriation. On the other hand, why not see it as a dialogue, as an opening up that she was, and also you can't get rid of this so-called appropriation. What would that mean? You say you're not going to show it. All of the whole history we're talking about, and let's go back to that image you showed me on the phone, is, and going back further, takes aspects of art that existed in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, and so on, often not viewed as art in the Western sense. Sometimes it was carpets, sometimes it was clothes, and the artists themselves were open to that, and were wanting to interact with that in a way to lose themselves. So. This is a beautiful set piece to end with, because Gauguin, it's such a haunting piece, because Gauguin is specifically leaving Europe, going to Tahiti, and the influences of the non-European are, central. You can't look at the painting without seeing that. He's insisting that you see that. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, nowadays we think of it as appropriation on the one hand, or perhaps we think of it as problematic, people do, and that you shouldn't even show Gauguin because of his attitudes toward the young women that were in the paintings, which are now which are seen in a different light than he saw it in, and maybe it's because of all of those problems that it violates and makes explicit that the painting is so haunting and so indeed beautiful.
Just going to add to your comments on Gauguin, the wonderful painting. Indian artists made those same journeys within India. Yeah, Indian artists made those same journeys within India, which we now attribute, to Europe, to a few European artists like Gauguin making those journeys to other parts of the world. Indians, moderns, are making those journeys within India and, responding to what they see in ways that inform, help them create a new style, make them understand what they call academic art is inadequate to creating this new style, which cannot just be called a new Indian style. It's a new style that's happening, in many places, subverting realism and subverting Orientalism as well in Gauguin's case. So, I think what I was just trying to say is a new style is being created through these encounters between different countries, but within nations themselves, and certainly for India,
So let me end with this show of Nancy Spiro, and we just stumbled upon it. I didn't know it was here. So Susan B. and I knew Nancy Spiro and her work, and it's so great to see this in the museum, especially after all I'm saying, because I can't think of another artist who tried to incorporate, almost everything that I'm saying into her work. And I'm not going to give a lecture on Nancy Spiro, but one can almost see it in the because here we have the kind of the Greek. She's really rethinking the history of art, through what she's calling their active histories. So perhaps that's what you and I are trying to do here, create active histories.
So we've just come out of the Museum of Modern Art onto 53rd Street, and Charles used to kind of come here when he was a teenager, as he said, or maybe even earlier, I don't know. and he was talking about these buildings, and we're going to end with a few thoughts from him about what he sees here right now.
Right. So, well, I mentioned that the Museum of Folk Art was torn down. That's just down the street. I mean, every street in New York I could talk about, as many native New Yorkers could, at great length. One of the problems with my consciousness is that I could talk about almost anything. Sometimes it's interesting and sometimes not. So Gauguin, the sublime to the kind of ridiculous. But anyway, right across the street is the library that I went to from a teenager on. It was the library where you could look up articles and books, and you did research in the library. It's called the Donnell Library. So as part of this reconstruction of this whole street into these multi-million-dollar office towers, they tore down that library, which was 2 large floors, and they agreed to put in this very small pocket library in the bottom, which doesn't have any of the research facilities or it's just a kind of gutted shell of what that library is.
When did that happen? When did the reconstruction happen?
I would say this was probably, it could have been as much as 20 years ago.
And when did this MoMA come?
And this is also about 20 years ago. The same time. The same development to 53rd Street in Midtown. And it's, libraries are the most important spaces. Also, we got records out. I used to take LPs out, and spoken word LPs from this on the second floor. It just represents, it's not that they didn't even really replace it.
Is it the same second floor?
No, there's no second floor now. I believe it's just the one floor.
Okay.
It's a little like a pocket thing. And if we want to just drive this point further, if we went down the street that way, we would be at the Trump Towers.
Yes.
The golden Trump Towers, which would represent exactly a sort of aspect of what I'm talking about. And it's a kind of branding. I mean, everything is branded. Like in this case, Ron Lauder, who's the Estee Lauder Cosmetics company, everything is branded by the corporate patrons. And the corporate patrons are also the people who are, supporting the real estate industry and all the rest. So, in a sense, the concern to have these large, modern skyscraper, multi-million-dollar residences and so on is, dwarfs the library and the artwork, which could be shown in more modest circumstance. It doesn't have to be in the multi-million-dollar space. They can move it actually to other parts of the city as well. But it's not what the branding is. And I guess that's what I've been talking about. The problem with branding, both by museums and art history, and also the wonderful work that curators do at the Museum of Modern Art and other museums and art historians that have encouraged me to say the things that I've said.
Thank you, Charles. That was wonderful. Thanks.